Hello, everyone, and welcome to Death Talk Unscripted. My name is Paula, and I'm your host. I'm a DeathWalker. I'm a MAID advocate. I am a writer, and I also am in the process of setting up a nonprofit. The title of the podcast says it all, Death Talk Unscripted. I talk about death in real life, real time, and raw, and I shoot it straight as I possibly can so that everyone can become just a little bit more comfortable when we talk about death. Today's episode is When Legal Doesn't Mean Accessible. The hidden barriers to MAID, which is medical aid in dying for anyone who is not familiar with it, and VSED, which is voluntary stoppage of eating and drinking in America. Well, today we're going to step into the truth that breaks people long before their bodies do. And when I say that, I really mean it in the fact that we're going to be talking about a truth that in general terms usually will make people turn this podcast off, or they'll switch to another one, or they'll just completely ignore what's being said here. So the truth of what I see over and over again in this work is exactly what I just said. Sometimes the actual truth of talking about someone's death and what their end of life wishes are is far more painful, is far more traumatic than even what their bodies are doing in the dying process and, how it's getting there. It's the moment when someone realizes truthfully that what I want is legal, but I still can't have it. Medical aid in dying is legal in 12 states now, I do believe. Don't quote me on that. I don't really have the statistics in front of me at this particular deal. And VSED, which is voluntary stoppage of eating and drinking, it's legal everywhere. And yet you hardly hear about it. It's not even in the conversation with most palliative care, or even in a hospice setting. It isn't talked about, even though it's legal everywhere. And the other thing that's interesting about voluntary stoppage of eating and drinking is that even though it's legal, there isn't a whole big production with trained staff and just the program itself that would allow people to have access to it. Refusing treatment is legal. That's a whole thing where people really, if they start refusing treatment, then they're going to get the shaming thing. Oh, why are you doing this? Oh, buck up. Keep fighting. Don't stop. Don't resist. Advanced directives are legal. And a lot of people will talk about their advanced directives, and they'll even think about it for a long time. But the percentage of people who actually follow through and put something together and then turn around and talk about the advanced directives with families and friends and community to see if that you even have anyone that can hold you up with your end of life choices, with what your advanced directives say. And yet, like I was saying, when people try these options, they discover the truth. And the truth is, legal does not mean accessible. Legal does not mean supported. Legal does not mean possible. And that gap, that cruel silent gap, is where people begin to unravel. And that's the sad thing, because they're already dying. They're already in the prognosis of knowing that their bodies are going to shut down and that their time here on this earthly plane is just about done. And there's really a heartbreak. It's a silence too. I mean, nobody talks about it. It's really a silent, traumatic heartbreak of legal is illegal, but impossible. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from being denied a choice that you were told you had, that on paper it says it's legal. On paper it says you have done everything that you are supposed to do to abide by the law in legal forms to have the end of life choices that you so choose. And if one of those choices happens to be what I mentioned in the above paragraph that I was just talking about, then it really is about realizing that you're being denied a choice that you were told that you had. It's where fear turns into desperation. And I got to tell you, there's a lot of desperate people out there. There really is, folks. I get emails and I get private messages, and when I answer them, people are surprised. They're surprised that I took their call. They're surprised that I answered their email. How sad is that? That's how desperate people are, that they're reaching out, but they're not even expecting anyone to answer them or listen to them. It's where thoughtful, grounded adults start considering unsafe, isolating paths. Not because they want to, but because the system leaves them nowhere else to go. It's, like people telling you, go this way, go this way, go this way, and then there's a big wall and there's nowhere else to go. And they said, oh, well, it's really a street, but it doesn't lead anywhere. So today, we're going to name the barriers clearly and compassionately. And I also would like people to stop blaming themselves for a system that was never built for them. Let me rephrase that. Let me say that again. Stop blaming yourselves. Stop blaming let people stop blaming themselves for a system that was never built for them. A patchwork of yes, no, and good luck. I mean, it's really quite disheartening. Medical aid in dying, MAID, is legal, like I said, in only about a handful of states. We've got 12 now. But even in those states, access is fragile and inconsistent. And then there's Florida. There is no MAID law here at all. I mean, even though 75% of the population in this state say, yes, we would advocate for it, we would want it, there is no one actively talking about it. And if you do, based on politics, basically right now in this state, and the climate that we're living in, there's just no MAID law. There's no talk about it, and there's no pathway. There's no infrastructure, and there's definitely no protections for people and their end-of-life choices with VSED or MAID or stopping treatment. The other thing I would like to say from the point of where I live and in the climate that I, get up with every day, which is Florida, the people who want medical aid in dying, they must uproot their lives. They must leave their support systems. They must navigate a bureaucratic labyrinth in another state while they're dying, or while they're in the palliative state of hitting, in that time where they should be free, have all their end-of-life choices met so that they are completely and accessible to die in what I would consider those people's version of a good death. It's destabilizing, in my opinion. And I think it's very cruel. I think it pushes people towards unsafe alternatives because they feel abandoned. And when I say unsafe alternatives, I mean, I can use that nice verbiage and language, but the truth of the matter is they really do think about self-delivery. They do think about taking paths that are unsafe and unreliable. And again, they're doing this alone. Again, they're not telling anyone. It's in secret. And that's a horrible way for any human being to have to end their life, to that's the last stage appearance. That's the last movie that they'll be playing in, and they have to die in secret. They have to find ways to self-deliver. They have to be allowed to, on paper, to say that they can die these ways, but when they actually want it to be followed through, when they are actually done talking the talk and walking the walk, they find that the system does not walk the walk. They'll talk to you all they want, but the system, they will abandon you. It is a system that, for medical aid in dying, it is a system that is technically legally here, but it's one of those, yes, we're here, but in order to get it, you are going to have to be able to have the luxury of being able to be even able to access medical aid in dying. Voluntary. Now I'm going to drop over into voluntary stoppage of eating and drinking, and that's exactly what it sounds like. It's when people voluntarily decide to stop eating and drinking. A lot of the clients that I have spoken with, only one or two that I have actually walked with the whole consultation of what voluntary stoppage of eating and drinking actually entails. But I have never actually participated in one as a death doula. I have just been an observer through one of them. And it was one of the most poignant. At the same time, it was also one of the most gut-wrenching, hardest visual aspects to watch for a human being who really and truly, this was their only choice. The person that I was working with had ALS, and it was going to be just devastating at some point. She had a very small circle, a very small community, and most of them were also of her age, and they were also in the process of their own health issues. They were having their own, getting ready for their own end-of-life choices as well. Voluntary stoppage of eating and drinking is technically legal everywhere. In all 50 states in this country, the United States of America. But the word legal, it's a very hollow word when there's no one that will support you through it. VSED is a very medical and clinical version of dying. It does require 500 hours. It is exactly what it says it is. It is a stoppage of eating and drinking. It is allowing the body to shut down, and on that premise of, stopping the eating and drinking. It is a process where, yes, they do keep you as comfortable as possible, and it is, to me, in my opinion, after being as observing it, it is a huge emotional and mentally hard path to go. You have to be so resilient. One of the things that I found interesting in the session that I had been privileged to, be an observer and watch, was the family, the person who was dying, the client who had the ALS. They had done videos way early in her prognosis, from the day that they got it, from, the very first moment that this started really affecting her life. She did videos. She had her family video her so that she could talk about and speak why she was doing it and what she was feeling, and from the heart. And so when she got in those dire moments of actually going through the process of VSED, they would play these videos that she had made, and it would re-energize her. It would put her back in a spiritually wonderful place of her remembering, and I love that word, her remembering that this was an end of life choice that she had absolutely, from her gut-wrenching soul and heart, had desired. And she had gone through all the legal hoops. She had found the people, the proper care to have it done. Her family was actively involved. They had helped her, like I said, record these videos, all during the process up until going to the voluntary stoppage and eating and drinking. She had created some artwork, and she had made some, I wouldn't call them workshops, I mean worksheets. I would call them more along the lines of motivational and inspirational readings that she would have some of her family read to her. She would recite poetry that would help her have the strength to carry on. And it was, like I said, one of the most soul enlightening, but it was also gut wrenching too, from a human perspective of watching and seeing how the body, how the emotion, how the physicality, the spirituality, even the mental anguish and stuff that occurs during this time. I'm gonna not really switch gears or anything, but I want to bring up the fact that hospice dominates this landscape in the United States of America. MAID and VSED, they're barely whispered in hospice. Now, when I say this, think about this. Hospice is the go-to end-of-life path that we pretty much send everybody down. And 70% of the population, they probably absolutely will end up going just down the hospice path as if, that was just their full intentions their entire life. But it's an entire landscape. It is the entire dying process and death program that we have. And it amazes me that the medical aid in dying and the voluntary stoppage, eating and drinking, they're barely mentioned. And, it's weird to me because hospice gets all the airtime. They get the funding, they get the staffing, they get the cultural approval, and they get the medical training. And yet with MAID and VSED, by comparison, they're barely whispered. It's avoided, it's pathologized, it's misunderstood, and really, it's treated as taboo, these two things. And, refusing treatment or having an advance directive or a DNR. And it just boggles my mind how we can say that these things are legal, but they're not accessible. And hospice, it has a megaphone, and when you think about medical aid in dying, and VSED, they're like a paper cup and a string. I mean, that's really how far the gap is. And the silence is not neutral at all. It's harmful in so many ways. And I will go into that in another podcast, of course. But when people cannot talk about their fears or their preferences, they start to make decisions in the dark. They feel alone. They feel ashamed. They feel unsupported. And that's when things go wrong. Let's talk a little bit about funding and staffing. Why hospice thrives while other options are starved. This, I don't really have a whole lot of reasons why from my point of view. I think that hospice receives the Medicare funding, the Medicaid funding. I think that they give you the insurance reimbursement. They have interdisciplinary staffing. And they have, again, like I said, the national infrastructure. They are the megaphone. And medical aid in dying and VSED, they receive none of that. It's an afterthought. They're like the redheaded stepchildren of, the industry. And there's no federal funding. There's no insurance coverage for either one of those. You have to pay out of pocket. And if you're wealthy and if you have the private insurance, then yeah, you'll have a little bit more flexibility. You'll have a little bit more accessibility to these two. But that number is so small. That percentage is so small. There's no standardized training. There's no workforce. There's no pipeline. And even the states that have it, the states are wrapped up in themselves. The states medical aid in dying, or VSED, is very particular to that state. There's no pipeline from the 12 states to open up and connect each other so that they can all work hand in hand. And I get it. Hospice has nurses and social workers and chaplains and volunteers and medication and equipment. They have home visits. Now, these are all going to be severely affected when, with our with the way our culture is going and with the problems that the healthcare industry is having. That is cracking and crumbling right before our very eyes. MAID and VSED have whatever the dying person can privately pay for. And that's just the raw freaking truth, people. No bullshit about it. MAID and VSED, what do they have? They have whatever a dying person can privately pay for. Whatever clinicians are willing to risk. Whatever support can be cobbled together. This is not a level playing field. This is structural inequity. And that's just the bottom line. We profess that all these things are legal, and you can Google it, and you can look at you can ask any AI thing in the legal form, and they will tell you that yes, they're legal, yes, but read the buts, because there's a lot of them. There's going to be work. There's a workforce shortage, and there's lots of burnout. Anybody noticed from COVID on that there's been an extreme burnout, even in hospice? The most resourced model is struggling with shortages and burnout and turnover and inconsistent quality, especially the nonprofits. The private hospices, they're capitalistic and they make money. But the nonprofits, funding is getting slimmer and slimmer, and staff's getting burnt out, and volunteers aren't lining up. And so if hospice is barely holding on, or if they're going to get to that point, what chance do MAID and VSED really have? I mean, I sit here and think about that a lot. We really don't have any healthcare plan right now in this country. It's just kind of winging it as you go, and hope and pray that somewhere along the line there's a plan or a program or something where you can at least get moderately adequate healthcare. And that's a sad thing, because imagine the family who has a dying person. Imagine the family whose member just got the prognosis, and they're walking into a broken system with the most nationally acclaimed end-of-life choice option, which is hospice. So again, I ask you, what chance does medical aid in dying and VSED have? Without systematic support, they remain out of reach for most people. And when people cannot access the care they need, again, I'm going to go back, they start to improvise. And improvisation at the end of life is dangerous. It rarely ends well, and I speak from experience in that. I belong to the Hemlock Society, and I also belong to a group called Make Euthanasia Legal. And one of the biggest books that goes around is The Final Exit. And anybody who has taken any path of looking seriously into end-of-life choices and just are not satisfied with what is out there in the common place of this culture, they start looking at other options. And so they start looking into The Final Exit. And there are other books that outline other means for end-of-life choices. And they're complicated and they're hard, and these choices are meant for people who, they just don't, they're not being listened to. They're just not being given the choices that they want. Voluntary stoppage of eating and drinking is legal, like I was telling you, but only supported if you're already dying. Here's the truth most people don't know. VSED is only supported by hospice if you are already terminal. You have to be certified by 2 doctors as having 6 months or less to live. If you are not terminal, you must self-fund everything. Did you hear that correctly? VSED is only supported by hospice if you are already terminal. So if you have ALS or MS or any of those chronic diseases that are going to end up very poorly for the dying person in the dying process, in this country, you cannot ask for VSED unless, and qualify under our hospice umbrella, unless certified by 2 doctors as having 6 months or less to live. Sounds a lot like medical aid in dying, don't you think? If you are not terminal, you must self-fund everything, which is the same thing with medical aid in dying, which I have already discussed about having to uproot your life, travel expenses to get to a state, finding a state that doesn't have a residential requirement, being able to find the Airbnb or the clinic that you're going to use, being able to take someone with you, have a family member there. Not all your family members, of course. So it is a catch-22, literally. There's private duty nurses, there's death doulas, there's palliative medications, and this is what I'm talking about, self-funding. You're going to need your own care coordination. And so after I've said all this, I'm going to repeat this. VSED is legal. But clinical access is almost non-existent unless you're already dying. And when people realize this, excuse me, they panic. They feel cornered. They feel betrayed. This is where the mental breakdown in people start to really happen. I mean, they start to sink into depression, and they start to have those dark thoughts, and their energy becomes low. And, it's not because they're reckless. It's out of despair and desperation. This is where legal access versus clinical access comes to mind for me. There is a massive difference between legal access and clinical access. To me, legal access means the state won't arrest you. I mean, that's the whole thing with the legal. When I say it's legal, it means that the state won't arrest you. Clinical access, on the other hand, means you can actually use the option safely. Big gap between those two definitions. Again, it's like having a chasm, the rift open wide up, and you're standing on, people are standing on either side, and you can't get both of them. So most end-of-life options in the US are legal. Very few are clinically accessible. Most end-of-life options in the US are legal, but very few are clinically accessible. And that is, like I said, the gap where people fall through. This is the gap where people feel abandoned. This is the gap where, again, I will say this, that decision making becomes unsafe. It becomes dark. It becomes secretive. It becomes even more lonelier than they were when they first started out on the journey. And they feel they have no other path. This brings me back to the darker side of this podcast, and hospice holds most of the dying population. And they kind of hold it hostage. They kind of hold it and dangle it as some sort of golden goose egg. And hospice guides the majority of Americans to their deaths. They do, like I talked earlier. But that also means that hospice continues to control the narrative, the resources, the staffing, the medications, the cultural script. And that's a very scary thought if you think about it. And it's very unnatural. It does not follow the natural rhythm of what death is, or what the educational value of death, of not having fear, not feeling abandoned, being able to speak your truth, being able to be seen, heard, and to be recognized as the most important person in the room, the dying person, and their end of life choices are theirs and theirs alone. It is sovereignty. It is autonomy. It is, and I will say this, it is a basic human right, whether it's in the Constitution or not. And when I talk about hospice, hospice does beautiful work for many. But there is a portion of the population who do not want the hospice model. And so what do we do for them? What's the solution? What's the game plan for these people? There's almost nothing, and that's the truth of it. There's no clinical pathways. Hospice is the only fully built house. MAID and VSED, their blueprint, they're sitting in an office somewhere, and people have written up the blueprint, but they've not gone anywhere else with it. It's like, yeah, we have it, but we don't really have it. But look, here it is. But no, it's not really workable. So it's a blueprint. And it's taped to a wall, basically, or sitting somewhere in a cubbyhole collecting dust. Here's the hardest truth. End-of-life choices currently for the elite. Yes, I said it. And yes, I'll say it again. The end-of-life choice in America is currently for the elite. The end-of-life choice in America is not equal. It is not accessible. It is not realistic for most people. It is for the wealthy, the resourced, the well-connected, the medical savvy, the people who can travel, the people who can self-fund care. Everyone else is left with hospice or nothing. Think about that. Everyone else is left with hospice or nothing. Can you understand why the desperation and despair kicks in? Can you understand why people look for other resources, other solutions, other game plans, even if they are dangerous, even if they aren't unsafe? This is not choice. This is a hierarchy. And that betrayal pushes people toward unsafe, unsupported paths. And again, not because they want to, but because they feel they have no other choice. There is no other way. And I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to go ahead and close and wrap up this podcast by saying that the reckoning when people cannot access the care they need. There is a reckoning to that. It is going to jump up and bite us in the ass. It is going to rear its ugly head. It is going to come from the shadows into the light. And when we have legal options that are blocked by clinical barriers, then we are already starting out on a negative path. We are already having a failure of communication, a failure of a system. Our systems are not supporting the autonomy and the sovereignty. And that is, in essence, by default, simply ignoring the whole death aspect, just telling people that, whatever, you have to die anyway, so just suck it up and do it. Again, people start making decisions in the dark. And it's not a failure of the individuals. By all means, no, there is no failure on the part of these individuals. The failure is of the systems. That's what I'm dogging. I'm dogging how the system is failing a large portion of the population. If we claim to care about dignity and sovereignty at the end of life, then we must ask, what are we willing to build? What are we willing to change? What are we willing to name? People deserve more than a legal checkbox. They deserve real options, real support, real pathways, real sovereignty. Death is not a privilege for the elite. It is a universal human experience. Every one of us are going to die. Every one of us are sitting in a queue right now, waiting for our call to be taken. And we don't know when it's coming up. And every human being deserves the right to meet it on their own terms, safely, supported, and most importantly, without shame. Good night. Thank you so much for tuning in, and talk about death. It won't kill you.